Picture a wooden table in a small ship's cabin off the coast of Jamaica, a single candle burning low, a sheet of paper laid flat, weighted at the corners with musket balls so it will not curl in the salt air, 11 lines written in plain English, a quill resting beside an inkwell. Now picture the line of men waiting to sign it, sailors with cracked hands and sunburned faces, some of them deserters from the Royal Navy, some of them runaway servants, some of them freed slaves, some of them merchant crewmen who had been beaten one too many times by a captain they could not fight back against. One by one, they step forward. They read the 11 lines, or they have them read aloud if they cannot read. They listen to what they are agreeing to, and then they sign their names or they make their mark, and they shake hands with the man who will be their captain, a man they have just elected by vote. That piece of paper, weighted with musket balls in a candle-lit cabin, terrified the British Crown more than any cannon ever did. The Royal Navy had warships. The Crown had wealth that stretched from London to Calcutta. It had armies and forts and admirals and a global trade network that no other empire could match. And yet for nearly 30 years it could not crush a few thousand men in small ships sailing out of the Caribbean. The reason was not the ships. It was not the cannons. It was not the rum or the black flags or the gold buried on lonely islands. The reason was that piece of paper. Because here is the part nobody talks about. The thing that made pirate crews more dangerous than Royal Navy crews of equal size was not lawlessness. It was the opposite. It was a written contract, a signed agreement, a constitution drafted in a cabin and ratified by every man aboard before the ship left port. The pirates had democracy. The Royal Navy did not. And on a wooden deck in the middle of the Atlantic, that turned out to be the difference between a crew that broke and a crew that did not. This is the story of how a piece of paper changed the course of history. To understand why the pirate code mattered, you have to understand what life was like for a sailor in the British world of the late 1600s and early 1700s. And the short version is this. It was hell. A merchant sailor in 1700 worked 18-hour days in conditions that would not be tolerated in any prison today. He slept in a hammock strung 6 inches from the next man's hammock. He ate salted beef that had been in a barrel for 2 years, and biscuits so infested with weevils that sailors learned to eat them in the dark to avoid seeing what they were chewing. He drank water that had gone green in its cask. He was paid, in theory, a few shillings a month. In practice, he was paid whenever the ship returned to port, if the captain felt like paying him, and the captain very often did not. If he complained, he was flogged. If he refused to work, he was flogged. If he was caught sleeping on watch, he was flogged. If he stole food because he was starving, he was flogged. Flogging meant being tied to a grating and whipped with a knotted rope until the skin came off his back in strips. 12 lashes was a light sentence. 100 lashes was a death sentence delivered slowly. This was the Merchant Marine. The Royal Navy was worse. The Royal Navy had a recruiting problem in this period. Almost no one volunteered. The pay was lower than the Merchant Marine. The discipline was harsher. The food was the same rotten food, and the wars were endless. So the Crown solved its recruiting problem by inventing the press gang. A press gang was a squad of armed sailors who walked through coastal towns at night and kidnapped men. They grabbed them out of taverns. They grabbed them out of beds. They grabbed them off ships that had just come into port. They beat them, chained them, and dragged them aboard a Navy ship that might not see England again for 3 years. Once you were aboard, you were the property of the captain. You could be flogged for any reason. You could be hanged for desertion. Your pay was held back until the voyage ended, partly to keep you from running, and partly because if you died at sea, the Navy did not have to pay your widow anything. A captain on a Navy ship in 1715 might earn £100 for a voyage. A common sailor on the same ship might earn 3. That is a ratio of 30 to 1. And the captain ate fresh meat at a private table while the sailor ate weevils. If that sailor lost a leg in combat, He was discharged at the next port with no compensation, no pension, and no transport home. He was simply put on the dock and told to find his own way. Many of them ended up begging in the streets of London for the rest of their lives. The crown that sent them into battle did not consider itself responsible for what came back. This was the world the pirates came from. Almost every pirate of the Golden Age had once been a merchant sailor or a navy man. They had been pressed. They had been flogged. They had watched friends die in conditions worse than livestock. And when their war ended in 1714 and the Navy threw them out with no pay and no prospects, they did not become pirates because they were evil. They became pirates because they had finally, after years of being treated like animals, found a way to be treated like men. But they needed a system, because the moment you put 200 armed criminals on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean, you have a problem. How do you keep them from killing each other? How do you decide who is in charge? How do you split the money? How do you make them fight together when the next ship appears on the horizon? The answer they came up with was so radical that the Crown would spend the next 3 decades trying to pretend it did not exist. By 1717, the Royal Navy had a problem it could not solve. Pirate crews were defeating Navy crews of equal or even greater size in open engagements. Not always, and not everywhere, but often enough that admirals in London began writing nervous letters to the Admiralty asking why. On paper, this should not have happened. A Royal Navy sloop and a pirate sloop carried roughly the same number of guns. They carried roughly the same number of men. They sailed the same kind of vessel. The Navy crew had been trained for years. The pirate crew was a collection of deserters and runaways. The Navy crew had a chain of command, regulations, signal codes, and officers who had studied gunnery at Portsmouth. The pirate crew had none of that. And yet, ship for ship, the pirates were winning. The Admiralty assumed at first that this was an aberration. A few unlucky engagements, a few cowardly captains. The solution, surely, was more discipline, harsher punishments, stricter regulations. The Crown doubled down on the very things that were already failing it. It did not work. The losses continued. Captains were court-martialed. New captains made the same mistakes. The pattern held. It took a long time for anyone in London to admit the obvious. The pirates were not winning because they were lucky. They were winning because their crews were fighting harder. A pirate crew fought for itself. A Navy crew fought because if it did not fight, it would be flogged. A pirate crew that captured a prize ship would split the value of the cargo among every man aboard, with shares written into a signed contract before the voyage began. A Navy crew that captured a prize ship would see the captain take a quarter of the value, the admiral take a tenth, the officers take their cuts, and the common sailors split whatever was left, if anything was left, which it usually was not, and which they usually would not see for months in any case. A pirate who lost a leg in combat received a fixed sum in compensation, written into the articles he had signed. 600 pieces of 8 for a right arm, 500 for a left arm, 500 for a right leg, 400 for a left leg, 100 for an eye, 100 for a finger. He could read these numbers on the document before he ever fired a shot. A Navy sailor who lost a leg received nothing. The technical mismatch was not in the ships. It was in the men. One side was fighting for ownership. The other side was fighting for wages, and most of them were not even fighting for that. They were fighting because the alternative was the lash. Take 2 crews of equal size and equal training, put them on equal ships with equal cannons, and ask them to face each other across 100 yards of open water. The crew that voted to be there will outfight the crew that was kidnapped to be there, every single time. It took the Crown years to understand this, and once it understood, it had to ask the question it had been avoiding for a generation. Why are we not doing what they are doing? The word code gets thrown around in pirate stories, but almost nobody actually knows what was in one. So let us break it down. A pirate code, also called the Articles, was a written document drawn up by the crew of a pirate ship before that ship left port. It was usually composed by the captain and the quartermaster together, then read aloud to the assembled crew, then revised based on what the crew wanted changed, then signed or marked by every man aboard. Once it was signed, it was binding. The captain himself was bound by it. Breaking the code was punished, and the punishment was also written into the code. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts' crew, drawn up in 1720, have survived because the Royal Navy captured a copy. They are 11 points long. They are written in plain English, and they read less like the ravings of criminals and more like the constitution of a small republic. Article 1. Every man has a vote in affairs of moment. Every man has equal title to the fresh provisions or strong liquor at any time seized. That is the first line. Every man has a vote. On a Royal Navy ship in 1720, the idea that a common sailor would have a vote on anything was beyond imagination. The captain decided, the officers obeyed, the men were silent. On a pirate ship, every man voted on where the ship would sail, what targets it would pursue, whether to fight or run, and who would be captain. The captain was an elected official. He could be voted out at any time by a majority of the crew. He had no special privileges except in combat, where his orders had to be obeyed without question, and in pursuit, where the same rule applied. In every other situation, he ate the same food as the men, slept in the same quarters as the men, and could be overruled by a vote of the men. Article 2. Every man shall be called fairly in turn by list on board of prizes, but if they defraud the company to the value of even $1 in plate, jewels, or money, they shall be marooned. Theft from a crewmate was punished by being put ashore on a deserted island with a bottle of water and a pistol. The pistol contained 1 shot. The implication was understood. Article 3. No person to game at cards or dice for money. Gambling created debts. Debts created fights. Fights split the crew. The article was practical. Most pirate codes contained something similar. Article 4. The lights and candles to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any of the crew, after that hour, still remained inclined for drinking, they were to do it on the open deck. Lights out at 8. A specific bedtime, written into the constitution of a pirate ship, because well-rested men fought better than tired ones. The same article noted that anyone who wanted to keep drinking could do so above deck, in the dark, where they would not disturb the men who were sleeping. Article 5. To keep their piece, pistols, and cutlass clean and fit for service. A weapons maintenance clause. Every man was personally responsible for the condition of his own weapons, and could be disciplined for letting them rust. Article 6. No boy or woman to be allowed amongst them. If any man were found seducing any of the latter sex and carried her to sea disguised, he was to suffer death. A strict no women aboard rule. The reasoning was not chivalrous. It was that women aboard a ship caused fights between men over the women, and the crew had decided this was unacceptable risk. The penalty for smuggling a woman aboard in disguise was death. The crew had voted on this. They knew what was at stake. Article 7. To desert the ship or their quarters in battle was punished with death or marooning. Article 8. No striking one another on board, but every man's quarrel to be ended on shore at sword and pistol thus. You could not fight aboard the ship. If you had a quarrel with another crewman, you took it ashore at the next landing and settled it with a formal duel under the supervision of the quartermaster. This kept disputes from spilling into the deck during combat, where a single fight could compromise the whole ship. Article 9. No man to talk of breaking up their way of living till each had shared 1,000 pounds. If in order to this any man should lose a limb or become a cripple in their service, he was to have $800 out of the public stock, and for lesser hurts proportionately. This is the disability clause. Lose a limb, receive $800 from a shared fund maintained by the entire crew. Lose less, receive proportionally. This was workers' compensation. It existed on a pirate ship in 1720. It would not exist in any factory in England for another century and a half. Article 10. The captain and the quartermaster to receive 2 shares of a prize, the master, boatswain, and gunner 1 share and a half, and other officers 1 1/4. A 2-to-1 ratio between the highest paid man on the ship and the lowest. Compare this to the Navy, where the ratio was 30-to-1 or worse. A pirate captain made twice what a common sailor made. He did not make 10 times what a common sailor made. He did not make 100 times what a common sailor made. The crew had voted on the ratio, and they had chosen something close to equal. Article 11. The musicians to have rest on the Sabbath day, but the other 6 days and nights, none without special favor. Even the musicians had a day off written into the Constitution. 11 articles, written in plain English, signed by every man aboard, binding on captain and crew alike, enforced by a quartermaster who was elected separately from the captain, specifically to prevent the captain from accumulating too much power. This was not lawlessness. This was a small floating democracy with a written constitution, an elected executive, a separate enforcement branch, and a workers' compensation fund. And the Royal Navy could not figure out why their men kept losing to it. Here is the part that should have embarrassed the British Crown into silence. England in 1720 considered itself the most enlightened government on earth. It had a parliament. It had limited the power of its king after the Revolution of 1688. It had philosophers writing about liberty and the rights of man. It had laws, written constitutions, courts, jury trials, and a long tradition of representative government that it traced back to the Magna Carta in 1215. And meanwhile, out on the deck of a stolen ship in the Caribbean, a crew of escaped sailors, runaway slaves, and unemployed soldiers had built something the Crown only pretended to have. The pirates had functioning elections, real elections, every man 1 vote. The captain served at the pleasure of the crew. If the crew lost confidence in him, they could remove him by a majority vote at any time, except during combat or pursuit. There was no House of Lords on a pirate ship. There was no king. There was no inherited title. The man who had been a slave 6 months ago had the same vote as the man who had been a navigator. The pirates had separation of powers. The captain commanded in battle. The quartermaster managed everything else. The quartermaster was elected separately. He distributed food, settled disputes, supervised the dividing of prizes, and acted as a check on the captain's authority. If the captain wanted to do something the crew had not approved, the quartermaster could veto it. This was not theoretical. Quartermasters overruled captains regularly, and the captains had to accept it or face a vote of confidence. The pirates had a written constitution, not a vague tradition, not an unwritten custom, but a document, read aloud, signed, witnessed, binding. They had it 50 years before the American colonies wrote theirs. The pirates had workers' compensation, a formal, written, funded compensation system for men injured on the job, $800 for a lost limb, drawn from a shared pool. England would not have anything resembling this for working people until the Workmen's Compensation Act of 1897, almost 200 years later. The pirates had equal pay ratios. The captain made twice what the lowest paid man made. In the Royal Navy, the ratio was 30-to-1. In the East India Company, it was worse. Among the pirates, the men had decided that no person on the ship deserved to make more than double what the cabin boy made, because they had all signed the same articles, and they had all faced the same risks. The pirates were not anti-monarchist philosophers. Most of them could not read. They had not studied John Locke. They had not read the political pamphlets being printed in London. They had built their system from scratch on wooden decks by trial and error, because the system the Crown had given them had broken them, and they needed something better. And the something better they had built was, by almost every measurable standard, more democratic than the government of England. The Crown could not say this out loud. The Crown could not even let itself think this. The pirates had to be portrayed as monsters, as devils, as the enemies of all civilization, because the alternative was to admit that the so-called enemies of civilization had built a better version of it in international waters, with no formal education and no permission. This was the irony that powered the entire golden age of piracy. The men the Crown called criminals had achieved, on a stolen ship in the middle of the Atlantic, the thing the Crown only claimed to be. By 1718, the British government had tried force. It had tried bigger ships. It had tried bigger bounties. It had tried hanging captured pirates from gibbets at the entrance to colonial harbors as warnings. Nothing was working. The pirates kept coming. The Caribbean was bleeding. So the Crown finally did something it had not done before. It offered its own contract. In September 1717, King George I issued a proclamation known as the Act of Grace. Any pirate who surrendered to a royal governor by September 5, 1718, would receive a full pardon for all acts of piracy committed before January 5, 1718. No questions asked, no trial, no prosecution. A signed paper from the Crown saying that the man who held it was a free man again. This was the first time in the entire conflict that the Crown was competing with the pirate code on its own terms. The Crown was offering paper for paper, a royal pardon for an article of agreement, legitimacy for piracy, safety for risk. And it worked partly. Hundreds of pirates accepted the pardon in the first year. Benjamin Hornigold, the man who had trained Blackbeard, took the pardon and switched sides. Many of the older, richer pirates who had been at the trade for years took the pardon and retired. They were tired. They had enough money. They wanted to die in beds. But many did not. Edward Thatch refused. Charles Vane refused. Bartholomew Roberts had not yet become a pirate when the pardon was offered, and when he did become one, he refused on principle. Calico Jack Rackham accepted the pardon, then immediately went back to pirating, then refused the second one. The pardon worked for the pirates who were tired of pirating. It did not work for the pirates who believed in what they were doing. And here is what the Crown could not understand at first. The pardon was not just about safety. The pardon was about asking a man to give up something specific. It was asking him to give up his vote. It was asking him to give up his share. It was asking him to give up his right to be elected to a position. It was asking him to leave a small floating democracy and rejoin a kingdom where he would be a subject again, with no vote, no share, and no say. For the men who had only become pirates to escape press gangs and floggings, the pardon was attractive. They had not wanted to be pirates in the first place. They wanted to go home. For the men who had become pirates and discovered something they had not known existed, the experience of being a citizen of a working democracy, however small and however brief, the pardon was not enough. The Crown was asking them to surrender something they had not had before they signed the articles, and could not get anywhere else once they signed away their pardon. So the war became, for the first time, a war of paperwork, the articles versus the pardon, the contract versus the proclamation. Two competing offers, written on two pieces of paper, fought over for the soul of every sailor in the Caribbean. The Crown was, finally, fighting the pirates on the right battlefield. It had taken 25 years. The first pirate code was not signed in the Caribbean. It was signed in the Caribbean, but it was not signed by men who called themselves pirates. They called themselves buccaneers. And the man who refined the system into something the next generation would inherit was Henry Morgan. Morgan was a Welsh privateer who operated against the Spanish in the 1660s. He led raids on Portobello, Maracaibo, and Panama City. He commanded fleets of small ships and crews that numbered in the thousands, and he ran his operations on what were called chasse party agreements, written contracts among the crews that divided the spoils and compensated the wounded. 600 pieces of 8 for a lost right arm, 500 for a lost left arm, 500 for a lost right leg. The numbers that appeared in Bartholomew Roberts' articles 60 years later were taken almost directly from Morgan's compacts. Morgan was not a pirate by his own definition. He had a letter of marque from the English crown. He was technically a legal raider, but his contracts were the prototype. The system he used to keep his crews together, written shares, voted decisions, compensation for injury, was what the pirates of the next century would inherit, refine, and turn into the most effective small-unit organizational structure in the Western Hemisphere. The Buccaneer Compacts were the rough draft. The pirate articles of the 1710s and 1720s were the final version. The lineage was direct. The masterpiece of the pirate code was the Articles of Bartholomew Roberts, and Roberts himself was the masterpiece of what those articles produced. Roberts was not born a pirate. He was the second mate on a slave ship called the Princess when it was captured by pirates in 1719. He was 37 years old, sober, literate, and reportedly furious about being forced to join the pirate crew. 6 weeks later, the pirate captain who had captured him died, and the crew elected Roberts to take his place. A captive had become a captain by vote within 6 weeks. What Roberts did over the next 3 years would never be matched by any other pirate in history. He captured over 400 ships, not 4, not 40, 400. He took prizes off the coast of Brazil, off the coast of West Africa, off the coast of Newfoundland, and across the entire Caribbean. He once captured a fleet of 22 ships at anchor in a single attack in Bahia Harbor. He once held an entire port hostage off Newfoundland and burned 26 vessels in the harbor while their crews watched from shore. He commanded a crew that grew, at its peak, to over 500 men across multiple vessels. And that crew held together, fought together, and stayed loyal to him for 3 years across 2 oceans, despite operating in conditions that would have shattered any conventional military force. The reason the crew held together was the Articles. Roberts had inherited the basic structure of the pirate code, but he refined it, he tightened it. He insisted on the lights-out rule and enforced it strictly. He insisted on the weapons maintenance rule. He insisted on the no-gambling rule. He himself drank only tea. He read the Bible aloud on Sundays. He ran a tight, disciplined, almost Puritan ship. And his men, who could have voted him out at any time, chose to keep him because he was making them all rich. When the Royal Navy finally caught Roberts at Cape Lopez off the coast of West Africa in February 1722, his crew did not run. They did not surrender. They fought. Captain Challoner Ogle of HMS Swallow approached Roberts' flagship under false colors, then opened fire at close range. The first broadside killed Roberts almost immediately. A piece of grapeshot took him in the throat and he died at his post. His crew, seeing their captain dead, did what no Navy crew would have done. They kept fighting. They fought for 4 more hours. They wrapped Roberts' body in his cloak and threw it overboard, as he had requested in his standing orders, so the Navy could not display it. They fought until the ship was crippled and the masts were gone and there was no possibility of escape. Only then did they surrender. 272 men were captured. 75 of them were tried and executed. The rest were sent to prison or sold into indentured servitude. The largest pirate trial in English history was held in Cape Coast Castle on the African coast, and it took weeks to process them all. Why did they fight for 4 hours after their captain was dead? Why did they not break? Why did they not run when running was still possible? Because they had signed the Articles. They had voted to be there. They had a stake in the outcome. They were not fighting for Bartholomew Roberts. They were fighting for the crew, which was them. The captain was replaceable. The Articles were not. And then there is the counterexample, Edward Lowe. Lowe was a pirate captain who operated in the early 1720s, around the same time as Roberts, in roughly the same waters. He was famously cruel. He tortured prisoners for entertainment. He cut off the lips of captured captains and made them eat them. He burned ships with their crews still aboard. He killed men who refused to join him. And here is the thing about Edward Lowe. He did not run his ship by the Articles. He ruled by terror. He ignored the votes. He overruled the quartermaster. He treated his crew the way a Navy captain would treat his crew, only worse, because there was no admiralty to constrain him. His crew deposed him. In 1724, after years of escalating cruelty and increasingly arbitrary decisions, Lowe's own crew voted him out, put him in a small boat with no provisions, and set him adrift. He was never seen again. Some accounts say a French ship picked him up and hanged him. Some say he died at sea. The point is that his own men ended him. Bartholomew Roberts followed the code. His crew fought for him 4 hours after he died. Edward Lowe ignored the code. His crew threw him overboard while he was still alive. The code was not a quaint custom. It was the source of the strength. The captain was not the source of the strength. The captain who tried to be the source of the strength got himself killed by his own men. By 1726, the golden age of piracy was essentially over. Most of the famous captains were dead. Roberts was dead. Blackbeard was dead. Vane was dead. Rackham was dead. Bonnet was dead. Lowe was dead. The pirate population of the Caribbean had collapsed from perhaps 4,000 at its peak to a few hundred holdouts operating mostly in the Indian Ocean. The Crown had won. But it had won in a way that nobody likes to admit, because winning required becoming, in small and quiet ways, more like the enemy. In the decades that followed the suppression of piracy, the Royal Navy began to reform itself. Not all at once, not because of any sudden conversion, but steadily, under pressure from desertion rates, mutiny rates, and the cold realization that crews who were treated like animals fought like animals badly. Sailors' pay began to rise, slowly. Conditions began to improve, slightly. The first pension system for wounded sailors, the Greenwich Hospital Fund, expanded its coverage. Prize money distribution was reformed to give common sailors a slightly larger share, though never anything close to what the pirates had given themselves. Press gangs continued, but the abuses became publicly controversial in a way they had not been before. The mutiny at the Nore in 1797, 70 years after the Golden Age ended, was sparked by sailors demanding the same basic things the pirates had written into their articles in 1720. Better pay, a share of prizes, compensation for the wounded, the right to refuse service under abusive officers. The Crown granted some of it. It hanged the leaders for asking. But it granted some of it because by then the lesson had finally been absorbed. You cannot make men fight by flogging them, not for long, not against men who have chosen to be there. And there is a broader lesson in the story of the pirate code that goes beyond pirate history. Imposed discipline breaks under pressure. Chosen discipline does not. Every army that has tried to fight a motivated volunteer force with reluctant conscripts has learned this. The British in America after 1776, the French in Algeria, the Americans in Vietnam, the Soviets in Afghanistan. In every case, the larger force, the better-equipped force, the force with more cannons and more men and more institutional backing, found itself losing engagements to smaller forces that had voted to be there, that had a stake in the outcome, that had signed the articles, in whatever form their articles took. The pirates discovered this in 1700 with no political theory and no formal education. They discovered it because the system they had escaped from had broken them, and they needed something better, and they built it from scratch on wooden decks in international waters, because nobody was watching and nobody was going to stop them. What they built was not a fleet, it was not a strategy, it was not even a way of life, it was a piece of paper. The articles were not signed in blood, despite what the legends say. They were signed in ink on paper, with witnesses, in candlelit cabins by men who could not read the words they were marking. They were drawn up by quartermasters and read aloud by captains, and ratified by raised hands and shaken hands. They sat in oilcloth bags in sea chests and traveled with the ships that carried them. They were ordinary documents. That is what made them dangerous. If you made it to the end, you already know more about the real organizational history of pirate crews than most historians did 50 years ago. Hit subscribe. I cover forgotten history like this every week. And if you want to see the story of the pirate fleet that operated as a coordinated multi-ship navy under written articles for almost a decade, the closest thing the Atlantic ever had to a pirate nation, that video is on screen right now. Click it.